Hi, I'm Drew Hastings. I'm the owner of Bell's Opera House, where we are right now. This is a remarkable building, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about it. The part you've missed so far is where we came up the stairs to through a big double staircase that people came from far and wide to come view shows here, beginning back in 1895. Cut over here for a sec, you'll see Bell's Opera House opened November 1895. It only took about 9 months to build, and it was built by Mr. Bell, who was a big philanthropist here in Hillsboro, Ohio. What I want to talk to you about, we're going to move through the Opera House a little bit, is this is the ticket office. When you came up the stairs to the Opera House, you came to this ticket window. If the door was down, that means you were too late, you couldn't get tickets. If it was up, and this little thing was open, you could buy tickets, get your ticket, and proceed into the Opera House. It originally sat 1,000 people, which was a whole lot for back then. And after you got your ticket, depending on what price ticket you bought, you went upstairs to the balcony, which we'll see a little bit later, or you went straight onto the main floor. Let's head over there now. Okay, so the first thing that would happen, once we come out of the ticket area, a patron would walk in here, they would decide where they're going to sit, and they came into the main area. You came in through one of these 3 doors. And there was a big raked floor, about 650 seats on the first floor. And we'll take a look at that area now. Okay, so like I said, it was built in 1894 to 1895. This whole thing was done in less than a year. It's about a half of a city block. It's amazing when you think about that it was built that quickly, but they didn't have the kind of regulations we do now. And one guy, the very rich Mr. Bell, wrote a check to have it done and oversaw the construction. What you're looking at now is the floor of the theater. The seats are all gone now. We still have some samples, 5 or 6 of them, but the seats were disposed of probably 50, 60 years ago. What you're looking at over here are box seats for people that had a fair amount of money, and they would sit up in these box seats. The blue wall that you see back in there is just ornamental. That was put there in the 1960s just to kind of create a little backdrop, but actually those box seats were much deeper than that. And you would have probably 4 to 6 chairs on each level, and they could view down. And of course, the main thing with the box seat, the way they're angled like that, is because the people who buy expensive box seats, they want to be seen by the audience just as much as they want the stage show to be seen. So it was a little bit of an ego trip. Originally, before the advent of recorded sound, which is when the Opera House came into being, there would have been an orchestra pit here. And you won't be able to see it with the camera because the wood lines are too small, but there was originally an orchestra pit here that had a small band, a piano, and a few musical instruments, and they would play music to the events that came along. You know, what's interesting is the opera houses had very short time span. They all were built right around 1895. This is all across America, predominantly in the Midwest. And the Opera House, you kind of think of it as the original multimedia center of its time. There was no central place for entertainment. And when opera houses were built, and they were mostly very popular and very prolific, they were built in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, some in Nebraska. And they all had a very similar type of layout and look, different sizes. Some sat 200, some sat 1,200. But the opera house brought people together from all walks of life. You had farmers who would come into town to the show. You would have wealthy people who lived in town. You would have people that were working class that couldn't afford much, that could buy a ticket, sit up in the balcony and see the show. So you had really anybody and everybody coming from miles around to one of these shows. Well, the problem with opera houses is they all came online and were built right around 1895. And they put up shows for about 10 years, 15 years, and everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, something called movies came out. And that was a big problem for opera houses. Okay, so we're on the stage. Now the stage at the Bell's Opera House produced a whole lot of different types of shows. There were Wild West shows. There was kind of scandalous, what you call can-can girl shows or dancing girl shows. There was opera. There were plays. There was something for everybody here. Now, what you see back here, some of these tall pieces of wood that are still back here stacked, those are the original flats. Those would have been covered with fabric and would have been used for scenery. Everything up above, which you can't really see, was the fly space where sets were dropped down and different backdrops were brought down. You see this big door here that opens up on the alley on the south end of the building. This would open up. That pulley, which had a very large pulley and a tackle on it, would swing out and could load anything up there. Trunks, it would load up heavy props, even live animals were brought up on this pulley system and brought onto the stage if they needed a horse or something like that on the stage. So those doors are still functional, open right up to the alley, but I'm afraid of heights, so I'm not going to be opening that. It was a pretty large stage. You had, like I say, there were varied productions that you had here, and you see a lot of clutter on the stage now. This is just an accumulation of stuff that was here. Frankly, when I bought the building in 2010, and there was a whole assortment of odds and ends in here. Some of it we've cleaned up, some of it we've kept. Anything that had any historic or architectural significance, we obviously saved. If you turn the camera around and look out, let's look out for a minute. You can see we've got a balcony. Balcony probably sat about 400 up there in the day. There would have been, it looks like bleachers up there, but there would have actually been chairs on all of those large bleachers or steps, and they would have gone all the way up. Like I said earlier, the heyday of the Opera House was for about 15 years up to about 1910. If you look up towards the back of the balcony, you will see a contained projection room. And that was, they weren't anything to look at. They were made of concrete because back then film was very flammable. And those were put together very quickly to shoot movies. And the movies were shot through those holes you see up there, the projection holes, came down here, they lowered a screen in front of the stage, and they shot movies. Well, that was fine for about 5 years. Then what happened was something called CinemaScope and Technicolor. And all the big movie production houses in Hollywood had big elaborate theaters, and it wasn't going to cut it anymore to essentially show movies through one speaker and a giant sheet, which is essentially what opera houses were doing. So opera houses had to scramble. At that point, they started doing different things to stay in business and survive. In the 1920s, there were boxing matches here at Bell's Opera House. There was a giant ring put down here on the floor, a standard sized boxing ring, and there was boxing, regional fighters came in from Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati, Kentucky, and they had 12-round boxing every Saturday night. And that helped. That was one of the different things they started doing to try to keep opera houses viable. It also became, at that point, a second-run theater because they couldn't compete with the big, nice movie houses. Here's a couple posters from the 1930s. The one on the left, which is really interesting, this was for a staged barn dance. They were doing a barn dance, but obviously on stage, and reenacting a barn dance. And it was hosted by WLW Radio out of Cincinnati, as you can see. Had a lot of local and regional bluegrass stars on there. You had bands from Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and all around the Cincinnati area that would come together for a show like this. The poster on the right, which is interesting because it still says Bell's Opera House. It was called Bell's Opera House up until some point in the 30s where they dropped Opera House and just started calling it Bell's Theater. And here, this was Harry Shannon's Variety Review. This would have been a variety show where you would have had singers, dancers, maybe a comedian, a musician, and girls, beautiful girls. So obviously they had, at some point, a chorus line of girls. So, and that was heading more into the vaudeville area. So here on these two posters, you see movies. These were advertisements for movies, which is what Bell's was known for over the last 50 years. This was 1936, May of 36. Here were the movies that were showing over the 2 or 3 weekends in May of 36. Over here, 1935, here's a James Cagney film, a Boris Karloff film, and a Gary Cooper film. And this was typical where they would put up posters around town and advertise the movies that were shown. And they usually cost about a dime to see. Danger. Why does that say danger? Well, that's because when they first introduced electricity in about 1910 into the Opera House, because before that it had no electricity. Believe it or not, this was lit by gas lamps. Not a very safe way to do it, but that's the way it was done in America up to that point. But they got electricity in around 1910. And this was a typical setup where you had panels like this. This is how you would turn electricity on and off. Not something you'd want to touch. There weren't a lot of safety features here, but that's how the theater was controlled. All the house lights, the stage lighting, and everything else was from this panel. Obviously, there have been improvements since that time. Okay, so you can see this advertisement here for a minstrel show. A lot of times the productions, the stage companies that came in, they would put up to advertise themselves and just almost like graffiti to say, we've been here. And they would put these up backstage around the theater. And a lot of times it was for friends because they might have 2 weeks later people they knew in the entertainment business that were coming in behind them. And so this would kind of tell them, hey, we were just here. These are all really very interesting. It tells you a little bit about the history of the time, what was going on, what kind of entertainment there was. And I don't think you can see it on this camera, but a lot of graffiti was written by actors that were here. I see here, for example, 1903. Here's somebody that signed his name and made a little message. Here's a guy in 1927. Here's somebody in 1915. So it's really interesting and amazing that this stuff has survived all this time. So you can see up here, this is the stage backdrop or the curtain for the Opera House. Originally, when I purchased it, it was down and you couldn't see the stage area behind it. We raised it up a couple of years after I got the place so you could see more of the stage. You can actually see the very large painting that's done on there if you go to the Bell's Opera House Facebook page, which you'll see a link for on your screen. So here you see, obviously not in a very organized fashion, but you see a huge collection here of some of the records of the Opera House. This is just one small batch of records that was everything from canceled checks to contracts to actually insurance records. The man who managed the Bell's Opera House for about 40 years had an insurance agency. He kept an office up here and he booked the theater and he ran his insurance business out of here. This is the underpinnings or the structure underneath the balcony. You can see how much lumber and how much wood was used in construction of this brick and wood structure. It's really amazing to see that kind of infrastructure done for a building like this. And it's all obviously in very good condition. There's no water damage, and it's just a really interesting architectural site to see. To me, one of the most fascinating things about this opera house is the fact that since 1895, when it opened, there have only been 3 owners. There was the Bell family, there was the Gordon family, and there's myself. And that's very, very rare in a historic structure like this that's over 125 years old. And that's really the reason why the Opera House has stayed in such good condition. It hasn't been gutted, it hasn't been cut up, it hasn't been vandalized, it hasn't been turned into something other than an opera house theater. It has stayed true to what it was, and that's because all 3 owners, myself included, were really very interested in seeing this theater one day renovated. Obviously the Bells weren't, because when they owned it, it was a new theater. The Gordons, who owned it after the Bells, Mrs. Gordon actually worked for Mrs. Bell. And Mrs. Bell had told Mrs. Gordon, and we're going back into the 1950s now, that she really wanted to see the theater saved. And I don't know if the Bells gave it to the Gordons or sold it to them at a pretty reasonable price so that they would be able to have it and take care of it, which they did to the best of their ability. But they were not well off, and all they could do is kind of hold off and keep any damage from happening to it and keep the building secure, which they did. And then the daughters of the Gordons, who had now grown up, moved away, California, New York. I was contacted by them in 2010 when I had moved to Hillsboro, and they got me interested in the building. Frankly, I had no business in an opera house. I had no idea what I would do with it. And from a real estate standpoint, I was interested in commercial property that was going to make me some money. And the opera house, I didn't see that as being the case. So what happened was they finally, we came to a price that made it an offer I couldn't refuse. I bought the building, subsequently put about probably at least $150,000 into the first floor, which was where the commercial buildings, stores are, retail and office. There's a drugstore, which you'll see probably shots of on the first floor. There's a drugstore, there was a mortgage company, there's a clothing boutique. And that enabled me to get income on the property and for it to be self-sustaining. Then about 2 years, around 2012, after I got the building, I was given a $250,000 grant from the state and the city to help secure the building. That was for new gutters, tuck pointing, new windows, all of it done historically accurately. That was the only way they would give you money. And so we got about $250,000 in 2012 to put into the infrastructure of the building. But the building itself has always been very solid. There's no structural cracks in this building. There's no big leans. The building has not in any way been compromised or has any weak areas. And it's been considered by Heritage Ohio, which is the big preservation group run by the state of Ohio in Columbus, to be considered one of the best examples of an unrenovated opera house in the entire Midwest, which is saying a lot. So I'm very proud of this building. The reason that I put it up for sale is because that I am one person. And really, an effort to renovate the opera house is going to take either a consortium or a large group or a nonprofit or somebody wealthy enough that they can write a check for a couple of $1 million and have the whole place done. So I am none of those three things. And so I thought it's best for me to divest of this property, try to find a buyer, hopefully somebody that wants to get it renovated and bring it back to the glory that it was, and make it viable for this community and as a regional draw, which I think is a distinct possibility. That's about it. You'll see some other shots on our way out of here. That'll just be some interesting things about the building itself.